Every empire that collapsed because of infrastructure failed for the exact same reason. The whisper grew louder, but the rulers grew more deaf. People think nations collapse in war, or in revolution, or in financial crisis, but the truth is darker. Civilizations die the moment they stop maintaining the things that keep them alive. The real apocalypse begins not at the front lines, but under the streets, inside old tunnels, across abandoned bridges, beneath rotting beams. Every society builds its greatest monuments during their rise, but collapses the moment it begins to believe those monuments will take care of themselves. That deadly illusion has wiped out empires bigger, richer, and more powerful than any country in the modern world. And right now, as you watch this video, the same silent loop is activating again. Imagine the fear of waking up one morning and realizing that the foundations beneath your feet, the water systems, the roads, the rails, the power lines, are no longer stable. Imagine knowing that the system collapsing around you isn't sudden, but the result of decades of neglect that everyone ignored. Now imagine discovering that this exact cycle has already happened 4 times in history, each one following a perfect, terrifying formula. Not similar, not close, identical. Once a nation enters the infrastructure death loop, there is no single point of failure. Everything fails together, first slowly, then violently. Just like Rome, just like the Soviet Union, just like Detroit, just like the UK. As water systems. These stories aren't lessons from the past, they are warnings for the present. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It fell because the Roman Empire forgot how to maintain what made it powerful. The aqueducts were masterpieces of engineering, carrying millions of gallons of clean water into cities across the empire. They represented Rome's wealth, efficiency, and control over nature. But towards the end, the empire was too broke, too corrupt, and too distracted by political chaos to maintain them. Stones weren't replaced, channels clogged, support beams cracked, and water, the substance every city depends on, slowed, then stopped. A civilization that once fed fountains, public baths, and thriving markets now watched its streets dry out and crumble. Imagine living in Rome during that time. Imagine seeing the water pressure dropping every year. Imagine hearing rumors that the nearest aqueduct had collapsed and nobody in the Senate cared enough to fix it. By the time invaders arrived, Rome was already collapsing from within. The fall was just the final push. The Soviet Union repeated the same mistake with its railways. While the West saw railways as arteries of economic power, keeping them modern, fast, and efficient, the USSR used them like disposable tools. Trains ran non-stop, tracks cracked from extreme cold, bridges rusted, stations aged. But repairs were always postponed because the state was obsessed with expansion, not maintenance. The government built more miles of track than it could ever afford to take care of. And by the 1980s, nearly 60% of Soviet rail infrastructure was already beyond safe lifespan. Trains moved slower, accidents increased, entire routes failed. When the economy collapsed, transportation collapsed with it, because everything relied on a system that the government never repaired. It was a death loop triggered by neglect. Detroit entered the loop not because it didn't know how to build, but because it didn't know how to maintain once its population shrank. At its peak, Detroit was the beating heart of American industry, producing cars for the world. But when the factories closed and money escaped and tax revenue vanished, the city stopped maintaining its roads. Potholes grew into craters, pipes froze, streetlights went dark. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned and the infrastructure around them decayed like exposed bone. The city was dying because of one mistake. It was slowly bleeding out because it couldn't afford to repair what it had already built. And then there's modern-day UK, where water pipes, some laid during the Victorian era, are bursting at record rates. Underground networks that haven't been replaced for over a century are now leaking billions of liters of water every single day. People assume it's a sudden crisis. It's not. It's the late stage of a death loop that began decades ago, when maintenance was delayed to save money. The bill is now coming due, and the cost of repairing everything is so massive that the system is failing faster than it can be fixed. All 4 nations experience the same cycle, the same stages, the same downfall. The pattern is almost mathematical. When a civilization reaches its peak, it builds fast. Roads, bridges, railways, water systems, power grids, everything. These things are built during times of confidence, celebration, and expansion. But as time passes, people forget the cost of keeping these systems alive. Maintenance budgets shrink. Small repairs are delayed. Easy fixes become expensive problems. Expensive problems become emergencies. And by the time anyone realizes the danger, the system has already entered the death loop, where failures cascade like dominoes. Once you enter, you don't climb out. And here's the terrifying part. Modern countries are entering the same loop right now, but nobody wants to admit it. Because nobody wants to accept that bridges can age, that roads can rot, that pipes can decay, that power grids can crumble. People trust infrastructure the same way humans trust their own heartbeat, silently, unconsciously, fully, until the moment it stops. This idea, that infrastructure is immortal, is the greatest lie civilizations tell themselves. Ancient Rome believed its aqueducts would last forever because they were built from stone. The Soviet Union believed its railways would last forever because they were built by the state. Detroit believed its roads would last forever because American engineering was unbeatable. The UK believed its water network would last forever because it had survived a century. Every nation thinks the same, and every nation pays the same price. Decline isn't dramatic at first, it's subtle. A bridge closes for repairs but never reopens. A train is delayed, but nobody knows the track beneath it is bending. A neighborhood loses water for a day, then a week, then a month. A power line flickers. A pothole grows. A streetlight fails. And the worst part? People get used to it. Once the public adapts to small failures, the government sees no reason to fix them. Once the government stops fixing them, the failures grow. Once the failures grow, the public loses confidence. Once confidence collapses, investment collapses. And when investment collapses, infrastructure dies completely. This loop has destroyed more civilizations than war, famine, or plague. Because infrastructure is the silent skeleton of society. You never see it, you rarely think about it. But the moment it breaks, everything collapses with it. Imagine a society that loses its water for 72 hours. Grocery stores empty, hospitals shut down, firefighting becomes impossible. Sanitation collapses, disease spreads. Imagine a society whose roads crumble, delivery trucks stall, food shortages appear, emergency vehicles slow down, businesses close. Imagine a society whose power grid fails, darkness spreads, communication stops, banks freeze, government loses control. Infrastructure failures aren't inconveniences, they're civilization killers. And every time, the story starts with one small decision. We'll repair it later. The Roman Senate said it. Soviet planners said it. Detroit Council said it. UK water companies said it. The modern governments around the world are saying it right now. What makes this pattern terrifying is not the disasters themselves, but the psychology behind them. Humans naturally prioritize building over maintaining. A new project wins votes. A new bridge looks good in newspapers. New infrastructure makes leaders look powerful. But maintenance is invisible. Nobody celebrates the pipe you replaced. Nobody tweets about the road you resurfaced. Nobody praises a leader for preventing a problem that nobody else can see. So maintenance becomes the first budget that gets cut, every single time. This psychological blind spot has cost civilizations thousands of years of progress. Rome's population collapsed because its water systems broke. The USSR's economy collapsed because its transportation broke. Detroit's housing market collapsed because its roads broke. The UK's trust in its institutions is collapsing because its pipes are breaking, and the loop is spreading further, faster, more globally. Right now, more than half the world's major cities are using infrastructure older than 60 years. Some are using systems older than 100. The average age of US water pipes is approaching the danger zone. Bridges across Europe are reaching the end of their safe lifespan. Railways in Asia, built during their massive growth booms, are entering their first true maintenance cycle, and the costs are enormous. Every country is pretending the problem doesn't exist, because the political cost of admitting decay is worse than the decay itself. But the decay doesn't wait. The pattern always ends the same way. Denial, delay, decay, disaster. People in Rome didn't believe their aqueducts were failing until water stopped flowing. People in the Soviet Union didn't believe the rail system was failing until trains stopped moving. People in Detroit didn't believe the roads were failing until entire districts became unlivable. People in the UK didn't want to believe the pipes were failing until water bills exploded and leakage reports became impossible to hide. And the most terrifying part? The next nation to collapse from this loop won't collapse because of war, politics, or economics. It will collapse because the system everyone trusted finally broke. As we move into the second half of this documentary, you're going to see how each of these four nations entered the loop, how the loop accelerates, and why modern countries are closer to collapse than anyone realizes. If the first half of this story showed how nations slide into the infrastructure death loop, the second half reveals something even more disturbing: the moment the loop becomes irreversible, the moment the system stops being repairable. Because history shows a horrifying constant. Once decay hits a certain threshold, maintaining the system becomes more expensive than rebuilding it. And when a nation cannot afford to rebuild, collapse becomes a mathematical certainty, not a possibility. Rome reached that threshold around the time its aqueducts required full reconstruction instead of patchwork fixes. Imagine standing inside an ancient valley where a 60-kilometer aqueduct once carried water with silent perfection. But now, stones have fallen out. Weeds fill the channel. Cavities stretch across the archways. For centuries, engineers patched cracks here and there, but eventually the maintenance to collapse ratio flipped. Repairs no longer restored function, they slowed failure. And when maintenance slows failure instead of reversing it, the society is already dead, even if it still looks alive on the surface. Romans didn't notice the moment the aqueducts passed the point of no return. They just woke up one day and realized the water pressure never came back. The Soviet Union found its point of no return in the winter of 1983, when dozens of rail bridges, strained by decades of nonstop freight, began cracking at the joints. Engineers warned that deterioration was accelerating geometrically, but the government did what governments always do when faced with infrastructure truths. They hid the reports. Rather than spending billions to rebuild rail foundations across 11 time zones, they threw temporary fixes at a system that was collapsing faster than they could react. The trains kept running on compromised rails. Every year, safety margins shrank. Every year, the loop tightened. And when the USSR fell in 1991, it wasn't just a political collapse. It was an infrastructural implosion 50 years in the making. Detroit crossed its threshold when entire neighborhoods lost basic services, and the tax base was too weak to repair even 1% of what was breaking. Imagine driving through a city where the roads resemble collapsed mine shafts. Imagine knowing that every time it rains, new potholes are carved like open wounds. The government tried to fix one block while 5 more failed. They tried to repair one pipe while 10 more burst. They tried to restore streetlights, but the underground cables were already dead. That's what irreversible decay looks like. You repair the symptom while the disease accelerates underneath. Eventually, Detroit didn't just suffer infrastructure failure, it suffered infrastructure abandonment. In the UK, the tipping point is happening in real time. Billions of liters of treated drinking water are leaking out every single day, flowing into soil, sewers, and rivers. Old Victorian pipes, never designed to survive this long, are exploding under modern pressure. Companies have admitted they would need decades and billions to replace the decaying network, but they don't have the money, time, or political mandate to tear up entire cities. So they do what every nation in the death loop does: patch holes, delay upgrades, issue reports, and pray the collapse doesn't happen during their leadership. But water systems don't care about elections. They care about physics, pressure, and metal fatigue, forces that obey no government. This leads us to the most disturbing discovery. Once a society enters deep decay, infrastructure doesn't fail individually. It fails together, because all systems are connected. A collapsed water pipe floods a road. A damaged road slows emergency services. Delayed services worsen fires, injuries, and accidents. A failing power grid disrupts water pumps. A broken railway disrupts food delivery. A damaged port cripples an economy. Infrastructure behaves like a living organism, and when one organ begins dying, the rest follow. Rome's aqueduct failure wasn't just a water crisis. It triggered sanitation collapse. Disease spread faster. Public baths closed. Markets shrank. Productivity fell. The city became weaker, poorer, sicker, and more vulnerable, making it easier for invaders to finish the job. The Soviet railway collapse wasn't just a transport breakdown. It slowed food distribution, reduced industrial output, increased operational costs, and starved cities of heat during winter. It wasn't the Cold War or capitalism that defeated the USSR. It was logistical suffocation. Detroit's road collapse wasn't just a pothole problem. It destroyed property values, scared businesses away, reduced mobility, increased emergency response times, and created a feedback loop of poverty and population decline. You can rebuild a factory, but you cannot rebuild a city once the population flees and the infrastructure rots. The UK's water crisis isn't just a pipe issue. It is a warning sign that the backbone of a modern nation is older than its own memory, and its failure would paralyze life in ways society is not prepared for. Here is the darkest truth of all. Civilizations rarely rebuild their way out of the death loop, not because they can't, but because the cost of rebuilding always becomes politically unacceptable. Leaders will happily spend billions on new projects, but they will never spend billions replacing things the public cannot see. A new bridge is a victory, a replaced pipe is invisible, a fresh highway is celebrated, a repaired drainage network is forgotten the moment the asphalt dries. The public rewards creation and ignores preservation. That psychological flaw becomes fatal at scale. Every civilization is engineered by brilliance and destroyed by neglect. It's not the engineering that fails first, it's the political will. When budgets tighten, maintenance is the first victim. When infrastructure ages, leadership becomes reactive instead of strategic. When decay becomes visible, the public becomes frustrated. When frustration rises, leaders make promises instead of repairs. And while the speeches continue, the structures that hold society together quietly degrade. But the real nightmare is that most countries today are entering the same danger zone. Many are already inside it without knowing. Some are further along than they admit. Some are hiding it. Some are pretending the cracks aren't cracks. And some are praying that the collapse happens under someone else's administration. But nature doesn't negotiate. Concrete doesn't care. Steel doesn't forgive. Water never stops eroding. Rust never sleeps. You want to know the most chilling statistic? Most of the infrastructure serving modern cities was built during population booms, times of rapid expansion, optimism, and confidence. But now those cities face slow population growth, stagnant budgets, aging systems, and rising costs. The exact same combination that triggered the fall of Rome, the collapse of the USSR, the decay of Detroit, and the instability of the UK's water systems. When society shifts from expansion to stagnation, maintenance becomes harder than construction. And when maintenance becomes harder than construction, decline becomes faster than progress. This is the moment the death loop tightens. Consider the average modern city: power grids from the 1970s, roads from the 1980s, water pipes from the 1950s, railways from the early 1900s. Yet the demands placed on these systems have multiplied several times over. More population, more industry, more pressure, more heat, more strain. The gap between what the infrastructure was designed for and what it's forced to handle grows every year, and one day the gap becomes fatal. Maybe it starts with a blackout, maybe with a bridge collapse, maybe with a water shortage, maybe with a railway accident that cascades into nationwide logistics failure. And when that day comes, people will say, "This happened out of nowhere." But history will know the truth. It didn't happen suddenly. It happened silently, over decades, because people assumed tomorrow would look like yesterday. Civilizations collapse exactly like human bodies, not through one catastrophic event, but through millions of tiny failures that were ignored until the system gave out. And just like the human body, by the time these failures become visible, the disease has already spread everywhere. The terrifying part is that infrastructure is the one thing people cannot live without. You can survive without technology, politics, entertainment, or convenience. But you cannot survive without water. You cannot survive without sanitation. You cannot survive without transportation. You cannot survive without electricity. You cannot survive without the invisible networks that make modern life possible. And yet, these networks are the things we protect the least. This is why the infrastructure death loop feels like a prophecy more than an analysis, because it is repeating with surgical precision. The symptoms are here. The warning signs are everywhere. Every collapse follows the same narrative arc: build, ignore, deteriorate, deny, breakdown, then disaster. The path is so predictable that historians can estimate collapse timelines with eerie accuracy. But here is the most critical part, the part people never want to admit. Infrastructure failure doesn't just destroy cities, it destroys trust. And once trust is gone, society fractures. When pipes fail, people blame the government. When roads collapse, people blame corruption. When electricity fails, people blame institutions. When everything fails at once, people blame the entire system. And that's when collapse becomes irreversible, not because of broken structures, but because of broken faith. Rome lost faith, the USSR lost faith, Detroit lost faith, and every modern nation entering the death loop risks losing faith next. Because the physical collapse is only half the story, the psychological collapse is the final blow. But there is one more twist, one last alarming truth. The death loop always ends with a public awakening. The moment when people finally see the cracks not as isolated failures, but as the early signs of systemic collapse. And when that moment arrives, citizens start asking the most dangerous question a society can face. If they can maintain the basics, what else are they failing at? That question destroys governments. It destroys political systems. It destroys national confidence. Once people realize their leaders cannot maintain infrastructure, they begin to doubt their ability to maintain anything at all. And now, as this documentary ends, here is the final unsettling reality. The nations that collapsed from this loop didn't collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because they assumed they were too strong to fail. If you've watched this far, you already know this pattern is not ancient history. It's not theory. It's not speculation. It's a warning. And if you want to understand how close your own country is to entering this loop, all you need to do is look at the cracks, the ones you walk past every single day. A rusted bridge, a leaking pipe, a failed transformer, a broken road, a delayed train, a blackout, a shortage, a collapse. Those are not accidents, those are symptoms. And if you ignore them, they will grow. If you deny them, they will spread. If you pretend they don't matter, they will define your future. So here is your final command, one that every viewer must follow consciously. The next time you step outside, observe the world around you. Notice the cracks, notice the decay, notice the failures, and understand what they truly mean. Because once you start seeing the signs, you can no longer unsee them. And once you can't unsee them, the truth becomes impossible to escape. The infrastructure. Death loop isn't coming. It's already here. And now that you know it, you have a responsibility. Stay aware. Stay informed. And never again, ignore the cracks that will decide the fate of your future.